So the measures that we have set up so far, at least the total sales measure, is really no big deal, because you could, without using the measure, we could still generate the total sales by simply setting up a pivot table. Okay, and suppose we use the year here, and instead of using the total sales measure, so you see the measure has a prefix fx, so that means that's a measure, as opposed to a box that you can check. That would be a column. Okay, suppose if I bring in sales amount column here, you see that the total sales is generated right there. So we didn't need a measure, okay, because the sum is already there that you can choose from for summarization. So the arithmetic operations that are already available to you, okay, without you having to define a measure, they are called implicit measures. Okay, the ones that we set up ourselves are called explicit measures. So implicit measure, explicit measure. Now, some people say that you should avoid using implicit measure. So far in pivot tables, you have always used implicit, one of the implicit measures, right? Okay. So one of the best practices in using Power Pivot is to never use an implicit measure. Okay. Always set up an explicit measure and use the explicit measure and the reason for that is that if you have an explicit measure, then you can use that explicit measure to create other measures that are derived from it. And therefore, even if it is possible, even if there is an implicit measure already available to you, it's better to set up an explicit measure so that it is available for further use if needed. Okay. And so is it explicit? And one more nice thing about explicit measures is that you can define the format once. So here, suppose if you set this up and then you go and change the format, then if you use the sum again somewhere else, then you again have to set up your format. So formatting is easy, and explicit measures, as I said, are available for use somewhere else. And there are a lot of advantages, so which we can make use of. So let's look at some more functions. So the DAX model has lots of functions that can be used. So I'm going to illustrate some more DAX functions now. Okay. So let's go ahead and create the following functions. Let's move all the way to the left. Okay. So you're going to enter transactions. Okay. And remember, when you do a measure, you have to for measures you have to use colon equal to. Okay. So suppose we want to count how many transactions there are in the database. Okay. So we have what is called count rows. Okay. So count rows gives you 60,398 rows, which is what you have. So there is an error. The red mark there indicates that we have an error, or maybe that's just a warning. Let's go here and manage measures, so transactions, and edit. So if you want to change something in a measure that you have already created, so this is how you do it. Okay, go to Power Pivot, Measures, Manage Measures, and Edit. So Now, so there's no errors in the formula, which is good. Or you can put a column here, and that will count how many rows there are. So this is fine. Let's close that. So that tells us how many transactions there are. So if you want, what is the order amount per transaction? How many? What is the dollar amount per transaction? Okay. So sales start from here. Sales per transaction. Yeah. Now, what would that be? So we already have total sales. Okay. Now, if you divide that by transactions, that will give us sales per transaction. And remember, this is not sales per transaction for the entire database. Okay. When you use it in a pivot table. Initially, yes. Initially, it will show you here. Okay, sales per transaction. This is going to give you the initial value for the entire database, $486. Okay. But when you use this measure in a pivot table, then the measure will be calculated for that filter context. Okay, suppose if you have January and year is 2002, then it will calculate the total sales for January 2002, calculate the number of transactions for January 2002, and then do the division, and it will give you dollar amount per transaction for that filter context, year and the month. Okay, you follow? All right. So one more function, and again there are lots of functions available. So that's the power of the DAX data model. Okay, you have all the Excel functions are available here too. So suppose we say days selling. So how many days did we have when we actually had sales? Okay. Let's see. Days selling, and for that we have a function called distinct count. Okay. So it will go to the column and it will count how many distinct values are there. Okay, so how many days did we have when we had some sales? Okay, if we can count how many distinct order dates there were, right? Order date. How many distinct order dates there were? Okay, this will tell us how many days we had sales. If we divide the total sales, okay, so now suppose if we say sales per day is total sales divided by days selling, so that will give us sales per day. Okay, let's format that to currency. Okay, and sales per transaction, let's format that to currency as well. And now we can use these measures in pivot table.